All right, Chapter 5, War and Empire. Notice that length of chapters, like the time period's getting shorter and shorter. So this is between 1754 and 1774, about 20-year span that we're talking about, 2 decades. There we go. Sorry about that. All right. So this is concerned with the French and Indian War because the English are fighting the French. They're also fighting the French allies, some of the Native Americans, some of the Indians. So it's also sometimes referred to as the 7 Years' War. But the opening battles of that, what the British are trying to do is to protect the colonies from the French and their Indian allies. Even before George Washington, he's going to lose Fort Necessity in July of 1754. What they're referring to is something that was talked about in the introduction to this chapter. So go back and read, the introductions, they always have like two stories of people, and that's what they're referring to as George Washington losing Fort Necessity. So go back and read that little intro and read more about George Washington. But what the British are interested in is an alliance with the Iroquois Confederacy, and delegations from the two sides met in Albany, New York in June 1754. So delegation between the British and the Iroquois, they're going to meet in New York to try to form an alliance. Benjamin Franklin, you've probably heard of that guy before, his plan of union, that would establish a colonial council to negotiate issues of frontier defense, trade, and territorial expansion on terms acceptable to both the Indians and the colonists. The Albany Congress that was created to form new colonial bonds, but it ultimately failed because the British government feared the proposed council would take over and wouldn't listen to British authority anymore. The Iroquois, along with other Indian tribes, they are able to gain leverage during this time because various imperial powers fought for control of North America. So what they're going to do is, all right, British, what can you give us that the French can't give us? And they're going to go to the French and they're going to be like, all right, France, what can you give us that the British can't give us? And so these conflicts between European nations, it provided Indians really with their best chance of survival. So this is a political cartoon created by Benjamin Franklin. It's the first political cartoon that we know of in American history to accompany an editorial that he wrote in the Pennsylvania Gazette. And so remember, this is a time when superstition is still a really big thing in the colonies. We just talked about witchcraft in a previous chapter. So his cartoon, what it's doing is urging the mainland British colonies to unite politically. So you'll notice over on the snake's tail, the serpent's tail, this is SC, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and then all of the New England colonies. And the reason that this was so powerful and that people understood what this meant is because that there was this superstition or this legend that if a snake, that a snake could come back to life if its severed sections were attached before dusk. So that's why you probably remember growing up, you always cut the head of the snake off and you separate it from its body, right? Well, in this instance, in this belief was you can cut a snake into all these different parts, but if you put it all back together before the sun sets, the snake will come back to life. So he's saying, although we are separate colonies right now, if we come together, we can defeat this attack between that we're having from the French and the Indians. But if we remain separated politically, we're probably one of us or maybe all of us will succumb to French leadership. We'll fall to the French, we'll follow the Indians, we'll lose that British tie that we have. So going back to those Indian tribes gaining leverage, they're going to use different negotiation strategies. So the Delaware, Huron, Miami, and the Shawnee nations, it's also called Miami, just in case you're wondering, like, why did she say Miami? But those nations, they allied with the French, hoping to stop British invasions of the Ohio Valley. The Iroquois pretended to negotiate with the French, hoping to win concessions from the British. The Creek, Choctaw, and Cherokee nations negotiated alternately with the English, the French, and the Spanish. The British decided to send additional troops to America to halt the French and Indian intrusions, and General Edward Braddock and 2 regiments arrived in 1755 to attempt to reclaim a fort. Militia units engaged French and Indian forces along New York and New England frontiers, but within months, Braddock was killed in an ambush by French and Indian forces. Extensive trading networks and help from various Indian tribes gave the French an advantage in fighting a long war. The French captured several forts, built another one on Lake Champlain, and continued moving into British territory. British ineffectiveness led to numerous Indian raids on frontier British settlements, however. So what we're going to see is the shift to a global war. We don't call it a world war, but it technically would be. But we see that British defeats in North America that encouraged other European nations to enter the war like, hey, maybe we could get a piece of this wealthy pie that the British have in the Americas. So France and England officially declared war in 1756. You have Austria, Russia, Sweden, Spain, and many German states are going to be Team France, while Portugal and Portia are going to be Team England. By 1757, battles had been fought for imperial possessions all over the world, and Britain, it appeared they were headed for defeat. So yes, they are fighting here in North America. They're also going to end up fighting in Europe. They're going to end up fighting in parts of India. So this is really happening all over the place. When William Pitt, he took over the British war effort in 1757, and he refocused it on obtaining North American victories, while letting Prussia protect British possessions in Europe. And he's going to recruit some young and ambitious soldiers from North America. In 1758, the British began to gain the upper hand. They and their colonial allies captured Louisburg on Cape Breton Island, and they're going to capture several forts on the St. Lawrence River. Prussia was victorious in Europe, and Britain won in India. In 1759, British General Geoffrey Amherst captured Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point on Lake Champlain, and General James Wolfe captured Quebec, giving Britain control of Canada. The war is going to drag on for 3 more years until Britain opened peace negotiations. Britain agreed to give up some spoils of war in the 1763 Peace of Paris, but still came out the clear winner. Britain reclaimed India, North America, east of the Mississippi, all of Canada, and some of the Caribbean islands. France gave Spain all of its North American land west of the Mississippi and Louisiana. Spain gave Florida over to Britain in return to reclaim Cuba and the Philippines. The wars between 1754 and 1763 reshaped Europe and North America in terms of trade alliances, but they failed to resolve existing problems between the colonies and Britain, and instead created many new ones. Britain's national debt doubled during the war, and the cost of administering the North American colonies increased dramatically. Britain needs to pay off her debts. She needs to raise funds and keep enough currency in circulation to expand trade. Also, the Peace of Paris ignored any Indian land claims in North America. So here is just showing you kind of where this French and Indian War is fought. Like I said, it's fought globally. It's fought here in North America. You can see here in Europe and parts of Africa. Also over here in India. It's just showing you the Africa because the Mediterranean is used during this war. But you can see up here who is all on what team, right? So Prussia and Portugal are with Team England or Great Britain. And then Team France is Spain. Some of these German states, Austria, Hungary, Russia, they're all with Team France. You can see where the major battles are taking place. And then the main areas of fighting here in India. And then also, of course, here in the colonies where this is playing out. The British victory did encourage colonists to move further west into formerly French-controlled lands, and this movement increased tensions between the southern and western frontiers. The Cherokee Nation dissolved its trade agreement with South Carolina in 1759 in response to repeated incursions into their territory. They attacked backcountry settlers in South Carolina and Virginia until that General Geoffrey Amherst sent British troops into Cherokee territory in 1761 to stop the warfare. The soldiers they sacked 15 villages, they killed all the inhabitants, and they burned their crops. Basically, he said, any Indian is a bad Indian and get rid of them all. Complete annihilation. British raids weakened the Cherokees, but the Indians' sporadic attacks on backcountry settlements deepened the resentment of backcountry farmers against the colonial political elite, who rarely took the problems of the frontier seriously. The raids also fueled anger towards Indians. When the British took control of the Ohio Valley, they made enemies of the local Indians by hunting on native lands, starving Indian villages, defrauding the natives, and ignoring traditions. of reciprocity. An Indian prophet named Neolin proclaimed that Indians had been corrupted by European contact and called them to return to their ancient traditions and reclaim their land. His visions inspired the Ottawa leader Pontiac to act against the British. In 1763, Pontiac called a council of Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Huron leaders to garner support for attacks on the British. Pontiac's forces laid siege to Detroit and subsequently attacked Fort Pitt and other British outposts, as well as settlements in western Virginia and Pennsylvania. Violence along the frontier sparked resentment among colonists and British troops. The colonists did not differentiate between friendly and hostile Indians. They just kind of killed everyone that they came in contact with. In December 1763, the Paxton Boys of western Pennsylvania attacked a group of friendly Indians near Lancaster, killing 30, and then marched on Philadelphia demanding the support of colonial authorities. Although frontier violence slowly died down, neither side won. Pontiac and his supporters retreated, and Benjamin Franklin negotiated a truce between Pennsylvania authorities and the Paxton Boys. But problems remained. In October of 1763, the British Crown created a buffer between colonists and Indians by prohibiting colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Proclamation Line of 1763 angered ordinary farmers and wealthy speculators such as George Washington, who had hopes of expanding into the Ohio Valley after winning the war against the French. So let me show you where they're talking about this line is. So you can see here, all right, after the war, we gain all this territory. The British gains all this territory all the way to the Mississippi River. And what the colonists want to do is like, okay, we're running out of room. It's crowded over here. We want to spread out across the Appalachian Mountains and go into the Ohio Valley, this area. But they're running into Indians, right? They're encroaching onto Indian territory. As we've come in and settled, we've been pushing natives back further and further and further. And they're putting their foot down and they're fighting. So the Paxton Boys, they go and they're going to try to take over the capital. And Benjamin Franklin stops them and stops them from really taking over. And what the colonists, like the authorities, come back and decide is, all right, we're going to draw this imaginary line down the Appalachian Mountains. And this is known as the Proclamation Line of 1763. And basically, see this red line? You cannot settle to the west. You have to remain east of this line. Quit going west and we won't have these problems anymore. That's not going to work for very long, but they do try to stop white encroachment of Indian lands with that proclamation line. So of course that's going to lead to conflicts over land and labor. They're going to begin to escalate because there's just not enough room, if you will. So in addition to those tensions along the frontier, you go back to these major cities and we see conflicts between landlords and tenants over leasing policies in New York and New Jersey. And that's going to continue into the 1760s. And pioneer settlers in the Carolinas began to clash with landlords and speculators. Large estate owners in New York began raising rents and reducing tenant rights before the end of the French and Indian War, and small landowners and tenants challenged some of these claims, and tenants asserted ownership of land that they had farmed for years. In 1764, the King's Privy Council decided that the Green Mountains belonged to New York and not New Hampshire. So when New York landlords tried to expand their dominance into the region, they came into conflict with farmers already living there. New Hampshire farmers fought against New York authorities, large landowners, and New York farmers who tried to claim land that others had cleared and settled. Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys established their own government and refused to recognize New York authorities. The Green Mountain Boys inspired an uprising in the Hudson Valley, and a group of tenants calling themselves levelers, and they were led by William Pendergast. They claimed the land they owned and the land they farmed and refused to pay rent to their landlords. They petitioned the New York Assembly for redress, but landlords refused to negotiate. Different groups in various colonies used the same methods in seeking fair treatment by the elite. They were well organized, chose their targets wisely, and first petitioned the courts and colonial assemblies, so they tried to go the legal way, before creating their own government institutions. Attacks on property were a popular tactic for challenging those in authority. Some common grievances that we're going to see, these are like post-war British policies that really unite the colonies. So British agents impressed colonists in port cities when the Royal Navy needed sailors. We've talked about impressment. You can go back and you can look up that key term in your book if you don't remember what impressment means. And although the practice had been going on for decades by the time of the French and Indian War and affected primarily the poor, colonists of all classes began opposing the practice. Impressed sailors had high mortality rate and received poor food and harsh treatment, and attempts at impressment were increasingly met with violence from entire communities. After the French and Indian War, riots erupted in major northern port cities as elite colonists joined with the poor in protesting impressment. Various colonial officials took a range of positions on the issue, with some seeking a compromise. Colonial officials who opposed impressment and those who advised compromise had to gain the support of working classes. Those elites who opposed impressment could direct colonial anger towards the British and away from themselves. And when British officials decided to continue quartering troops in the colonies at colonial expense, the elites found another common cause with the lower and middle classes. Not only impressment, but quartering of troops. Those are two things that are going to bring all colonists together. Although the soldiers were supposed to be preventing Indian attacks, they served as reinforcements for custom officials and impressment agents. So, they're there to protect us from Indians, but we're going to see that they are competing, the British soldiers are competing with colonial jobs, and they're also there to enforce collection of taxes and enforce some of these British policies that the colonists are not in favor of anymore. And these common grievances, they really created a sense of unity among the colonists as they began to oppose some of these British actions. Just to give you, here's just an artist's rendition of impressment, taking these men out and kind of kidnapping them and forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy. There we go. So poor and wealthy colonists, they forged ties with each other as they joined in opposing the British over issues of Western expansion, impressment, and quartering of troops. Those ties were localized in seaport cities or in certain frontier areas. To expand communication beyond these localized areas and have a greater impact on British policy, colonists turned to the techniques that were successful in spreading of the Great Awakening, using those communication networks. By mid-century, as new denominations continued to split off from traditional churches, many endorsed the idea of complete spiritual equality. In the South, for example, the separate Baptists converted thousands of ordinary farmers, poor whites, and slaves. The Methodists and some others, also like the Quakers, they also attracted Southern adherents by preaching spiritual equality. They challenged the social order by integrating their worship services, outraging slave owners and other elites. Most converts to radical Protestant sects did not view their conversion as political, but saw other religions as a divisive force rather than a unifying one. However, as more and more colonists protested British policies, the techniques of evangelical ministers could be used successfully to mobilize the populace. So what the Great Awakening had done, it created new techniques of mass communication, and its criticism of corruption and luxury appealed to people throughout the colonies. The habit of criticizing elites and local officials for disregarding the needs of the poor in a quest for ever greater luxury, that really transformed neatly into a critique of British officials who themselves loved luxury and spared little thought or compassion for the needs of the American colonists. So those popular techniques of revivalism that had been so successful in promoting a greater moral cause were now used to advance political goals too. Like in religion, they were talking about, like, you shouldn't be attached to these material things. You shouldn't be attached to luxury and corruption attached to those. And they're using the same thing. They're like, look, it's happening in politics as well. So the same thing that they were preaching in religion, they're going to start preaching that in politics. And British efforts to exert tighter control over the colonies only helped strengthen these intercolonial ties. So the British are going to come back, and now they've got to try to pay off the war, and so they're going to start to seek greater control. And for much of the 18th century, economic growth had encouraged Britain to ignore, just kind of turn a blind eye, this neglect, this benign neglect, to ignore the smuggling, the domestic manufacturing occurring in the colonies, because those activities, it didn't significantly hurt the British. But Parliament did not interfere in many local decisions because communication is really difficult. And as the colonies did not stray too far, it was easier just to let them make their own laws and kind of turn this blind eye to what was going on. So this benign neglect that's going on that caused some colonists to see themselves as more independent than they really were. They saw smuggling, domestic manufacturing, freedom from impressment, and self-governance as rights, not privileges. And they objected strenuously when the British tried to assert greater control. Keep in mind, those are not rights. Those are just privileges that they had been granted because Britain is turning a blind eye to all of that. King George III and his prime minister, a guy by the name of George Grenville, they believed that regaining stricter control over the colonies was not only proper, but at this point it's necessary. And Britain faced an economic crisis, growing unemployment, and rising protests over new taxes, trying to recoup that money that they lost during the war. So Grenville, he hoped that a stricter approach to the colonies would aid him in solving matters at home. Britain's in debt due to its participation in various 18th century wars, particularly the French and Indian War, and British subjects faced higher taxes to help defray the costs, though they had not benefited from the war as much as the American colonies had. Tighter control over the American colonies would reduce the cost of administering them, but imperial officials in America warned, if you try to impose this, you're going to come in direct contact with this new rebellious spirit among the colonists that had been subdued until now. So what Parliament is going to do, they're going to implement a three-pronged plan to try to bring the colonies back under tighter control. First, it's going to establish the Board of Trade and begin a strict enforcement of the Navigation Acts. Go back and read about the Navigation Acts. Second, it's going to extend wartime policies into peacetime by keeping British troops in the colonies. And under the Quartering Act of 1765, the colonies were expected to house, feed, and supply the troops. The third and most important part of the plan is probably how it planned to raise new revenue, and that was to put the colonies under tighter imperial control. One of the ways that they do that is by passing the Sugar Act of 1764. That imposed new duties on sugar, coffee, wines, and other luxuries, but it also reduced the duty on imported molasses, a prime commodity for smuggling. Additional custom officials and new vice admiralty courts in the colonies would ensure that the duty was collected. The goal was to reduce smuggling and ensure that the Sugar Act raised money for the Crown. Parliament also passed the Currency Act, which prohibited colonies from printing their own money. Kind of in general, the laws required colonists to pay more in taxes to Great Britain at a time when money supply in the colonies was drying up. So we're going to see protests against the Sugar Act, and that took form of, in the form of speeches, pamphlets, petitions, and leaders of the protests in Massachusetts created committees of correspondence to spread information to the other colonies. However, in spite of some attempt at coordination, protests, they're really in the beginning, they're disorganized, they're not very effective. The Sugar Act, the Currency Act, and the Quartering Act all increased anxiety in the colonies and marked the beginning of the conflict between Britain and the American colonies. And it's only going to get worse. So the Stamp Act, that inspires this very coordinated resistance. Grenville's new plan was to impose a Stamp Act. Stamp taxes had long been used in England and required a revenue stamp on all paper transactions, including any contracts, newspapers, playing cards, college diplomas, etc., anything paper. So Grenville announced his intentions in 1764, and the act became law the next year in 65. Grenville would appoint special colonial tax collectors, and the money raised, it was supposed to remain in the colonies to provide for colonial defense. So many members of Parliament believed the act was perfectly fair. The colonies paid very little in taxes compared to their English counterparts, and the revenue raised would directly benefit the colonies. The colonists objected to the Stamp Act for three reasons. First, the colonies were in the midst of a growing economic depression. Rising unemployment, falling wages, and increased trade imbalance, and the Sugar, Currency, and Quartering Acts had made the situation worse. Second, the colonists saw the Stamp Act as an internal tax designed to control the internal administration of the colonies. It was a direct tax on the daily activities of colonists rather than an indirect tax on trade. Third, the colonies were being taxed by a body in which they had no representation. You probably heard no taxation without representation. Because Grenville announced the Stamp Act a year before its implementation, colonial protesters had time to coordinate their opposition. In cities, new organizations such as the Sons of Liberty, Daughters of Liberty, and Sons of Neptune challenged the act. Stamp distributors were harassed and attacked until they swore never to sell the stamps again. The Virginia House of Burgesses was the first colonial assembly to formally protest the Stamp Act. The Virginia Resolves, which denounced taxation without representation, were reprinted in numerous colonial newspapers. The Massachusetts House sent a written protest to other colonial assemblies calling for a Congress in New York City in October 1765 to discuss the Stamp Act. So anytime you hear the word Congress, just think of it as a meeting in this context. So they're calling for, let's all meet. Let's get a representative from all the colonies and let's all meet in New York to talk about the Stamp Act. Popular protests became more frequent and more violent. And for example, in Boston, Samuel Adams and other Sons of Liberty leaders organized mass demonstrations. Adams drew on rhetorical style of itinerant preachers to deliver a political message. The Sons of Liberty also distributed anti-British materials. They hung an effigy of Andrew Oliver, Boston stamp distributor, from a tree. Kind of like give an example, like here's a dummy, we're going to hang it from the tree. If you try to collect taxes from us, this is what's going to happen to you. Protesters calling for Oliver's resignation, they marched this dummy, this corpse, this effigy that they had to the Boston Stamp Office before destroying the building. Oliver had left town before the crowd set fires to his home. So this is like pretty intense protesting that's happening. Popular protests became more frequent and more violent. And we have Thomas Hutchinson, Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, and all his brother-in-law only angered the crowd as he tried to defuse the situation. The mob then destroyed some of Hutchinson's possessions, which they regarded as examples of aristocratic excess. Violent protests again against the Stamp Act spread from Newport, Rhode Island to Charleston, South Carolina. The protests were so widespread that by the time the Stamp Act formally took effect, not a single stamp agent remained in his position. The protesters directed their anger at sheriffs, judges, colonial officials, and stamp distributors. Any violence was first directed at the destruction of stamps and stamp offices before the protesters turned to the property or officials themselves. The protests demonstrated a lack of deference towards British authority and revealed the growing power of non-elite colonists, some of whom took leadership roles in the demonstrations. The protests, however, were not rooted in class conflict because elites and non-elites joined together for the same goals. Although colonial elites regarded themselves as leaders of the protest, they refused to participate in actions they considered too radical. 27 delegates from 9 colonies attended that first meeting about the Stamp Act. So it's known as the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. The delegates, most of whom were elite colonists, argued the repeal of the Stamp Act, saying that taxation without representation was tyranny and a violation of colonial rights. Proclaiming their loyalty to the king, they nonetheless advocated a boycott of British goods and asked colonists to refuse to pay the stamp tax. So a key difference between the American colonists and the British centered on the definition of representation. The British promoted the concept of virtual representation. That is, members of parliaments represented the interests and views of everyone in the British Empire and all of her colonies throughout the world. However, American colonists believed that they needed to be represented in parliament and only by members whom they had elected to represent them in parliament. So someone from the colonies needed to be seated in parliament to help make these decisions. Although the delegates of the Stamp Act Congress proclaimed their loyalty to the crown, they were also developing a common American identity that was based on natural rights. Parliament replaced they repealed the Stamp Act in 1766 after British merchants complained that the boycotts were damaging their business. When news reached the colonies, the celebration included the ringing of church bells, fireworks, and musket salutes. The colonies hoped for better relations with Great Britain moving forward. So they are not talking about any type of independence at this point. They just saw that they didn't like something, they protested, they got their way, and they're hoping that their relationship with Great Britain improves and they have more voice in these decisions that are going to affect them. The widespread and effective Stamp Act protests convinced many colonists that parliamentary power was limited. Local leaders like Sam Adams and Patrick Henry became known throughout the colonies. The Stamp Act crisis also empowered ordinary citizens and revealed the effectiveness of distributing political broadsides, pamphlets, and handbills throughout the colonies. Few colonists believed the Stamp Act protest would lead to a full rebellion against British rule. In fact, many elite colonists were concerned that encouraging the activism of non-elites, encouraging the poor, could result in a revolt against the authority of colonial rich, the elites themselves. Most colonists, regardless of their social stratum, believed that the best course of action was to seek rights within the British Empire rather than to separate from it. So how are the British going to respond? Well, they are going to pass the Townshend Act. Almost immediately after the repeal of the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which affirmed its political power over the American colonies, basically saying we can declare any law anytime we want to and you can't do anything about it. And following the Declaratory Act, the colonies entered a period of relative calm. But in June 1767, Charles Townshend, the new prime minister, advocated a new tax along the model of the Sugar Act. The Townshend Act imposed an import tax on certain goods sent to the colonies, including glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Unlike earlier indirect taxes, which had occasioned little popular protest, this act, the Townshend Act, prompted immediate dissent. Samuel Adams wrote a circular letter promoting a boycott of the tax items, and the Massachusetts Assembly sent his letter to the colonies. To ensure the duties are paid, Parliament stationed additional troops in Boston and New York, but the colonies did not back down. Colonial leaders urged a boycott of all British goods. Women are going to be so important to the success of this boycott because they're responsible for purchasing the household items that were targeted by the boycott and were expected to forego a variety of British goods. Female shopkeepers were expected to participate in the boycott along male merchants. Women and girls began producing their own homespun cloth and herbal tea to replace items on the boycotted list. Colonial women supported the boycott by organizing spinning bees and producing ample amounts of homespun cloth. Wearing homespun demonstrated adherence to the colonial cause. In February of 1770, some 300 elite women from Boston pledged to boycott tea, and other women agreed to join them. The spinning bees and the tea boycott were part of an orchestrated effort to make Boston the center of colonial opposition. Boston's going to get us in trouble. Just watch. Boston leads, like that's kind of the start, the heartbeat of the American Revolution. South Carolina is going to be the start, the heartbeat of the Civil War. So we're in Boston now. Propaganda produced between 1769 and 1770 made clear that Bostonians rejected Parliament's right to tax the colonies. Confrontations between colonists and British soldiers continued into 1770. In addition to being angry over the import tax, many colonists opposed the troops because British soldiers took additional jobs to supplement their military salaries, thus depriving a lot of men in Boston from employment. Violence erupted on March 5th, 1770 in Boston, where 1,700 British soldiers were stationed in a city of 18,000. It all started as a snowball fight. So boys throwing snowballs at this lone British soldier standing outside the Boston Customs House. It attracted the attention of others, and eventually this huge crowd grew. That soldier called for help because now they're starting to throw snowballs that have stones in them and other objects, and it's hurting him. And he calls for help, and Captain Thomas Preston and another 7 soldiers, they responded to his cries for help. Although Preston, he appeals for calm, the situation escalated. More projectiles were thrown, and eventually a gun was fired. Shortly thereafter, the soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 4 on the spot and injuring 11. There was confusion regarding who, if anyone, gave the order to fire, but the colonists were outraged, and the leaders like Sam Adams recognized the potential propaganda value of labeling the shooting as a Boston massacre. Adams organized this mass funeral for those that were killed, and it was after 6 of the 8 soldiers involved were acquitted as a subsequent trial. Colonial protesters were even more convinced of Britain's tyranny, and it must be opposed. Committees of correspondence formed again to spread the news of this Boston massacre. The letter-writing groups were vital links between the colonies and allowed for coordination of protests and the dissemination of information. They circulated Paul Revere's engraving that showed Boston soldiers firing into an unarmed and peaceful crowd. Just know that that engraving, that was done on purpose. And the crowd themselves, those standing in the crowd, it doesn't show how they were throwing stones at the soldiers. It doesn't show that they were armed themselves. And it was done on purpose, right? Like this is the first use of like propaganda used to only show one side of the story. Responding to pressure from merchants on both sides of the Atlantic, Parliament is going to end up repealing townshend duties and um, other, but they're going to keep their tax on tea. Showing you the repeal of the Townshend Acts. We're going to skip this just because I want to get to the Boston Tea Party really quickly. So we go into a period of calmness, but that only lasted, after the Boston Massacre, it only lasted until May of 1773 when Parliament's going to pass the Tea Act. And this act granted the East India Company a monopoly on exporting and selling tea in the colonies, but did not increase the tax on tea or the base price of the commodity. The East India Company's monopoly created a new alliance between merchants and radicals like Samuel Adams, as colonial merchants would be excluded from profits of selling English tea. Adams and others had refused to pay the original tea tax and had kept up support for the boycott through committees of correspondence and Adams' Rights of the Colonies, that widely circulated lists of grievances against British policy. The committees of correspondence quickly mobilized to prevent the sale of the tea. In some cities, the tea was unloaded, but it was never sold. In others, the ships were refused permission to land, and the most famous protests occurred in Boston on December 16th of 1773, as members of the Sons of Liberty boarded East India's ships anchored in Boston Harbor and dumped 45 tons of tea into the sea. The Boston Tea Party directly challenged British authority in the colonies, but no one was willing to formally identify the perpetrators because they were dressed as Indians, but everyone in Boston knew who they were. But no one was going to rat them out. So Parliament responded in 1774 with the Coercive Acts, which closed the port of Boston, gave royal officials more power in Massachusetts while reducing the power of local officials, moved trials of royal officials from Massachusetts to England, and forced Boston residents to quarter British soldiers in their homes. The Coercive Acts, which the colonies called the Intolerable Acts, were intended to further stop protest, but they did just the opposite. News spread throughout the colonies. An armed group of colonists known as Committees of Safety joined committees of correspondence in vowing resistance to British policies. Other colonies came to the aid of Boston, and colonial leaders, now calling themselves patriots, recruited colonists of all ranks to uphold the boycott of British goods. In early 1774, patriots meeting in Williamsburg, Virginia, called for the delegates from all colonies to meet at a colonial congress, another meeting in Philadelphia in September. The Coercive Acts were supposed to quiet the conflict between the colonies and Great Britain, but they didn't. They only raised it to a new level. Colonists came together across socioeconomic lines to completely boycott British goods, and many colonists decided to oppose British policy with force. So we have the First Continental Congress. This first meeting included delegates from every colony except for Georgia, and it included men of various political views, many of whom had worked together in the Stamp Act Congress and on committees of correspondence. Some, like Sam Adams, were radicals, but others, like George Washington and John Jay, were moderate or conservative. The delegates agreed to resist British actions that violated the colonists' liberties, but they did not discuss independence. We're not there yet. The delegates wanted to return to the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain that had existed years earlier, when the British taxes were virtually non-existent. British troops were stationed elsewhere, and local officials had greater economic and political control. So very little direct control by British officials. That's what they want to return to. Delegates supported the continued boycott of British goods and proposed that the colonial elevate the protest by refusing to export American goods to Great Britain. They established new committees to coordinate the actions of individual colonies and upheld the power of the colonial assemblies. By 1774, more and more colonists supported the Patriot cause, both ideologically and physically. The delegates at the Continental Congress had no interest in completely remaking colonial society in terms of race and class, nor could the delegates address every colonial grievance. Still, the Congress is significant, that meeting, because it diverted power from individual colonies and purely local groups and instead emphasized actions that could be coordinated throughout the American colonies as a whole. The leaders of the protest would be the men of wealth and standing who sought the protection and help of the king, even as they battled the edicts of Parliament. So again, we are not debating independence just yet. That's going to come later on as we get closer and closer. We're going to fight for about a year and a half before the American colonists will declare American independence. So keep that in mind as we move into chapter 6.